The population in the United States is older than it has ever been. And the older adult population here in the US is projected to grow by another 47% by 2050. That is up to 82 million adults who are 65 plus compared to the 58 million that we had in 2022. This change will transform many aspects of our society. But one change we definitely need to prepare for is the safety of older drivers. By 2050, 25% of all drivers will be over the age of 65. Now, while it is true that younger, newly licensed drivers are the most likely group to be involved in a crash, the reality is that older drivers are more likely to be involved in a fatal crash. Today's featured article from JAMA provides this high-level overview of the complex driving needs of an older population and gives a glimpse into occupational therapy's role in addressing these needs. After we review this article, we will welcome to the podcast Ganesh M. Babulal, PhD, OTD, MSCI, MOT. Ganesh is one of the authors of this article from JAMA, and he is the leader of the DRIVES project at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Through this project, Ganesh is working to understand how preclinical Alzheimer's disease impacts driving behavior. So let's dive in. Welcome to the OT Potential Podcast, where we review new and influential OT journal articles, then invite on an expert guest to help us pull out actionable takeaways that you can implement in your practice starting today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Lyon, and I am a licensed occupational therapist. Before we dive into this topic of OT and driving, I wanted to let you know that this podcast may qualify as continuing education for you. You are probably listening to this podcast on a free podcast platform, but to gain CEU credit, you will need to be a member of the OT Potential Club, our OT continuing education platform. Bearing in mind that this episode could count as a CEU course, I wanted to state our two learning objectives so you can be thinking about them throughout the podcast today. Our first learning objective is you will be able to identify ways that OTs can screen for fitness to drive. Our second learning objective is you will be able to recognize the components of a comprehensive driving evaluation. So let's begin by looking at this journal article, and then we will bring on Ganesh to discuss how the information in this article could play out in your practice. The article that we are reviewing today is called Addressing the Complex Driving Needs of an Aging Population. It comes to us from the journal JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was published in 2023. So this article is from the JAMA Insight series, and this series is meant to highlight issues of high clinical relevance to clinicians in a way that is concise. JAMA is among the top 5 journals in medicine and science, and this is a pretty quick read, so I encourage you to check it out in full, but here's what's important for occupational therapy professionals to know. The article begins with an intro to safety in older drivers. Older adults can experience a decline in visual, cognitive, and motor functions, and these age-related changes can work in combination to adversely impact driving skills, for example, by causing delayed reaction time. As we'll cover in this next section, these changes often occur in conjunction with chronic diseases. So these aging factors may explain why older adults have the highest rate of death associated with driving. Compared to younger drivers who are 75 to 79 years old are at a 2.5 times higher risk of a crash death. Drivers over the age of 80 are at a 5 times higher risk of a crash death. Thinking about how medical impairment plays into this, numerous age-associated conditions increase the risk of driving impairment for older adults. Neurological and other conditions can lead to impairments that can cause mistaking the brake or gas pedal, failing to locate familiar routes, not observing traffic signs, and not maintaining lane control or appropriate speed. Conditions like seizures, syncope, arrhythmias, sleep apnea, and orthostatic hypotension also have associated symptoms that can abruptly threaten safe driving. Unfortunately, the medications then that we use to treat some of these chronic conditions can also have a negative impact. In case control studies, medication classes with increased risk of crash included benzodiazepines, anticonvulsants, and antipsychotics. Polypharmacy is also a growing concern for the aging population as it can lead to drowsiness. So those are kind of the high-level challenges for older adult drivers. What are the strategies out there to address fitness to drive? So despite the obvious risks, there are currently no validated criterion standard measures to determine driver safety. Still, primary care physicians can take several steps to assess fitness to drive. These can be encourage family members to accompany the older driver when appropriate so they can identify potentially unsafe behaviors. They can encourage the patient to reduce distractions, for example, turning off cell phones. Physicians can also investigate and correct reversible causes of driving impairment, such as eliminating sedating medications, treating sleep apnea, and referring to cataract surgery. In ambiguous cases, physicians can refer patients to a comprehensive driving test administered by an occupational therapist or driving instructor. Please note that Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance typically do not cover evaluations purely to assess driving ability. Driving simulators can be used by OT professionals to test performance skills that may not be safely replicable on the road. For example, the driver's response to a pedestrian walking into traffic. Another option for assessing fitness to drive is to use a GPS tracker to track real-life driving behaviors. Hypothetically, this naturalistic driving data could be used to facilitate risk modeling. Okay, from here, the article talks about driving cessation and duty to warn. Driving cessation discussions should be conducted with sensitivity and with family support if available. Considerations should be made for alternative transportation. Please note that as a clinician, you may have an ethical duty to warn your state licensing agencies of potentially unsafe drivers who refuse to stop driving. Some states provide civil immunity for clinicians who report unsafe drivers, while others have mandatory reporting laws. I'm going to link to this article that I found also in JAMA that has helpful information on the reporting requirements for medically impaired drivers. I do want to call out that the 6 states with mandatory reporting laws are California, Delaware, Nevada, New Jersey, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. So if you live in one of those states, I would definitely check this out. Okay, from here they head into a section on new driving safety technologies. 90% of all vehicle crashes are due to human error. Many new technologies are being deployed to make driving safer. 2 trends highlighted in the article are advanced driver assistance systems and autonomous vehicle technology. Starting with these advanced driver assistance systems, these advanced systems are designed to help detect crash risk stimuli and reduce driver error. Some systems will engage the brake when a significant risk is detected. But despite the promise of these systems, there is a lack of standardization and no comprehensive studies have been conducted to prove their effectiveness. And turning to autonomous vehicles, the Society of Automotive Engineers provides a helpful taxonomy of driving automation. It gives us a level 0 to 5, with 0 being basically no automation and 5 being full automation. I will also link to that chart. I think it's helpful to look at if you're interested in this topic. But contemporary manufacturers of autonomous vehicles are only at level 2 on this scale, going to 5, which would be full automation. And automotive engineers predict that vehicles will remain heavily dependent on human interaction for many years to come. The industry still needs to reduce costs, refine the decision-making of AI algorithms, conduct extensive testing, improve reliability in inclement weather, ensure security systems are tamper-proof, and work with federal driving regulations. So headed into the conclusion, while technology holds promise in helping older drivers, the reality is that it cannot replace human driving skills and cannot independently determine crash risk and safety. At this point, clinicians seeking to determine an individual's fitness to drive are best served by objective data from technologies coupled with clinical assessment. Okay, this article was very high level, but it was so helpful to me because I was one of those people who thought technology was already making us safer on the roads and would continue to reduce the need of OT in this area. But the data does not hold that out. There is so much need for occupational therapy, and I'm so thankful to have our guest today to really flesh out our role and our role in the years to come. And again, our guest is Dr. Ganesh M. Babulal. Ganesh is an associate professor in the Department of Neurology and Knight's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Washington University School of Medicine. He leads the DRIVES team on several studies that are funded by the NIH and the NIA and other organizations. And before I patch on Ganesh, I want to touch on one topic that we allude to in our interview, but I wanted to state explicitly, just to give you more context. Here in the United States, there has been an increase in traffic deaths starting around 2015. So even though our vehicles have all kinds of new safety features, we're seeing more automation on the road, our current strategy of placing our hope in technology to make our roads safer just does not seem to be working, and really needs to be reevaluated with all these older adults coming to the road. So I will link to this data in the show notes, but just wanted to say that explicitly before Ganesh comes on. But without further ado, I will patch Ganesh into this podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Ganesh. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm happy to be here.
This paper was such a great overview of just the challenge with driving in older adults and our increasing numbers that we're going to be seeing over the next decades. But this morning, I've also been diving more into your body of work and just how many interesting data points you are collecting about driving in older adults, and so many of them relate to OT. But I'm also sitting here wondering, what does this mean just really practically, especially for our outpatient therapists, for people who just dabble in driving? Like, what do we need to know in our practices? And I'm so excited to flesh all that out with you today. But before we get to those logistics, I just want to start with you and your story and how you got to all these papers. And I guess just starting with, how did you become interested in driving as an occupational therapist?
That's a great question. So I'd like to think it was all happenstance, but my interest really started in 2010 when I was doing my first master's in occupational therapy. My advisor at the time was examining carryover combat driving in veterans returning from OEF and OIF. And she was working at the time with the Office of the Surgeon General here in the United States to examine this phenomenon where troops who were deployed were trained in evasive maneuver to protect themselves, to protect their comrades. And so a lot of these included speeding at high rates, never stopping or slowing down for anything. If there is, for example, trash or anything in the road that could potentially look like an IED, swerving to avoid it. And what they found out was, unfortunately, the veterans that were trained to engage in these evasive maneuvers were returning back into civilian life and still executing those in traffic. Essentially, they were not able to regulate or turn it off. And so it was an interesting phenomenon because it was different from PTSD. And so we worked with the National Guard in Minnesota to create these materials and brochures and presentations to raise awareness. And it was eventually deployed in the Blue Ribbon and the Yellow Ribbon organizations, and to help raise awareness, but also to keep them safe along with their families and pedestrians. And so that sort of kickstarted my interest in driving research, but also just driving in general. And when I came to St. Louis to pursue one of two doctorates and eventually two, I received another opportunity to examine driving performance and subsequently driving behavior. But this time it was in the older adult population, so those that are age 65 and greater. But they were also cognitively normal. And so, but there was potentially an underlying disease process occurring, and this was in the context of Alzheimer's disease. And so over the past 10 years, I've really been enmeshed in driving research, looking at the road test, driving simulators, and more recently, data loggers that we can plug into a participant's vehicle to track where they're going on a daily basis. And over the past few years, more recently, we were some of the first researchers, not just here in the United States, but in the world, to show that a complex idea like driving could actually be used to predict preclinical disease states well before a person progresses and starts to decline. But we can really start to harness this important ideal and this complex function to not just discriminate between different classes or different diseases, but also look to see how overall community engagement participation is also being impacted.
What you just said there about driving, predicting Alzheimer's, that was some of what I was reading this morning, and hearing your story about getting interested in veterans or working with these veterans. There is just so much complexity to this topic. Thinking of all that complexity that you're looking at and taking in makes this article in JAMA so remarkable to me, because it's a pretty easy read. I think it was targeted at physicians to be able to take in the high level challenges and try to make it actionable for them. How did this article come to be? We don't see occupational therapy that often in JAMA, and definitely not penned by someone from an occupational therapy background. Can you just tell me, how did this come to be?
Yeah, it was quite serendipitous actually, because you were 100% correct. It's very rare to get published in JAMA, and just from as an OT, but more importantly, something that's so central in terms of thinking about it as an IADL. So actually, one of the editors from JAMA approached one of my very close collaborators and colleagues, Dr. David Carr, who's a geriatrician, and Dave reached out to me, and we talked a little bit about it. Do we want to put some time into this? And we both decided not only was this a very timely topic, but it was one that's currently not being addressed right now. And so primary care clinicians are really crucial for being able to look at driving, assessing, and discussing with their patients these very sensitive issues in terms of fitness to drive, planning to stop driving or driving cessation, but more importantly, whether or not they're unsafe and if they're at a risk for high crashes. But it's a very, very difficult conversation to have, because the clinician often could potentially jeopardize their relationship, not just with the patient, but also their reputation within a potential community. And so it's this really catch-22. And part of that discussion is how do we do this in a very meaningful way that talks about the complexities of this issue, and not just in terms of neurology, psychiatry, but also rehabilitation and professionals like OT, speech, and physical therapy. So what we did was we looked at, has there been any recent efforts in the United States to discuss this and strategize these critical areas that will allow us to engage with our aging demographic to achieve maximum autonomy and independence. And these are two constructs that I think are very ingrained to OT as a profession. And unfortunately, what we found was there really wasn't anything there. And over the past 2 or 3 decades, there's been a decline in publications and a shift in terms of the researchers and clinicians moving to different areas. And that, I think, galvanized us to say, listen, we need to sort of refresh and give some life to this very critical area, because there's so much more that's left to be done in terms of thinking about new technologies that are coming online, advancing research in transportation and community mobility. But more importantly, I think figuring out when is an older driver not safe on the road, and how do we address that in a way that's meaningful to them. So I think given all of these intersections with our aging population, shrinking pool of experts, not a lot of researchers and clinicians focused in the area, we were able to convince JAMA to say, this is what we want to put forth.
I think before reading this paper and preparing for this podcast, I, in my lack of knowledge, would have said the new technologies that are coming are going to save us from this problem. But as I read this paper and as I look at data, it doesn't feel like we're getting the fruit from these safety features yet. This really dispelled this myth in my mind. My question is, as you look at this paper, what stands out to you now? I know that it was published really recently, but I'm guessing you would have penned it a little while ago. What stands out to you now, and what has the reaction been?
That's great. And I love that you use the word myth, because I think there is this big panacea as technology for curing, all of these issues, and really that's what it is dispelling, what we're looking in terms of the mainstream, what's out there, and then actually showing like, look, there really hasn't been a lot of movement. So, granted, it's only been a year since it's been published, and in some academic circles, that's a long time, right? Especially when we're looking at how fast technology is rapidly evolving. One of the things that I think stands out is we did a great job in identifying the core constructs and the issues around the areas. This aging population, there's medical necessities, there's the need for more screening, in particularly thinking about the different ways for us to study driving behavior using on-road performance, road tests, looking at driving simulators, but also self-report from the patient's client or our participants. But I think the most significant that I would have loved to expand it more on is the naturalistic driving techniques. It's a vital component for data acquisition systems. So these are things in which you can plug into a vehicle. And what it does is it records behavior continuously, looking at the driver and other environmental factors as raw data. And so we've been using something like this for quite a few years now. And so we're able to capture spatial temporal data like speed, date, time, latitude, and longitude, but also threshold-based events like hard braking, sudden acceleration, hard cornering, but also impacts because it's got a gyroscope and an accelerometer built into it. But we can also look at miles, the types of trips that our patients, clients, or participants are taking, entropy, how far they're going around, from their home, jerk, unique destinations visited, and radius of gyration. And so I know those are all potentially foreign features, but they're all specific ways in which we can quantify the behavior itself to look at what exactly are they doing in their own vehicle, in their own home environment. And so part of the challenge has been, how do we put this together in a way that's meaningful? And we start looking and expanding a little bit more to not just predict when decline occurs or a person who's at risk for safety, but because the data is massive, right? And we're talking just a year's worth of data from the participants that we're following is a terabyte. And I have a full data team who monitors this on a daily basis, but we have to look at the computational power of complex machine learning models to crunch through the data to provide meaningful outcomes, right? You mentioned about what is the OT at the end of the day in a clinic? How can they potentially use this information, right? And so we're also looking at the data science end of things while making sure that we're keeping track of our goal, which is how do we make sure this is meaningful, it's usable for the practitioner, but then also impactful for the participant or the client.
The just different ways to think about this complex phenomenon of driving, all the data that you are gathering on it. It's so exciting. It also feels a little overwhelming to me thinking about practitioners. And I want to ask, given all this information that you've been gathering, what advice you have for us just in our day-to-day practice. I want to start with like screening or like light assessments. I don't know if this is what I should have been doing, but back in the day when I was an outpatient, I met with our group of doctors and I was just going through the services I provide. And I remember so distinctly telling them that if they have anyone struggling with driving, they could refer them to me and I could do some simple screens just to help the conversation. I didn't do driving tests, but they were so relieved to have that service. Every 6 months, they would refer someone to me, and I would do like the simplest, like cognitive range of motion and something with reaction speed. And I would get that data, and they then would have the driving cessation. Is that what I should have been like, what should I do now, given all that you know? Should we still be doing those simple screens? Should I be putting a tracker in their car? Like, what like low-level thing can the average outpatient OT do?
Fantastic question. And I don't feel bad because honestly, when I was in practice, I didn't really have a lot of potential screens in my toolkit. And like,
Yeah.
folks that were having problems, I'm like, well, I could look at, do a MoCA or a SLUMS or an MMSE, and we can see if there's cognitive impairment. But,
Yep.
just simply asking them, what does community mobility look like? How are you getting around, in your environment? Are you having any problems with driving, right? So simple open-ended questions can really start to kick off a great conversation. And so I think there's a lot of safety screenings out there that you can employ. Any OTs who's practicing, regardless of the field, as long as they're treating clients that can drive or they're at that stage. I think there's a lot of widely used fitness to drive screening measures, which would allow them to evaluate a person's driving skills just based on self-report. And then you can talk to what we would say is a collateral source, like a family, a friend, a loved one, saying, "Hey, have you noticed any changes in their behavior? Any potential deviations? Have you ridden with them and had any concerns?" That would provide a lot of a great source of information to then use to inform the approach with them, because it very well could be changes occurring within their vision, their hearing, whether there's issues in terms of neuropathy, limited range of motion that could potentially be treated and corrected, right? All of those impact. It doesn't necessarily have to be cognitive impairment that might influence them. So these are a plethora of tools that are widely available online. Another useful tool, I think, is the driving health inventory, which assesses physical, visual, and cognitive abilities related to driving. They're all very user-friendly for OTs to administer in various different settings, but to also identify potential risks that may lead to a higher risk for a crash. I think that's ultimately the end of the day. We want to prevent crash risk. And I think even if you don't treat clients on a daily basis that may have issues with driving, just incorporating these screens in regular evaluations, especially for our older adults, can help to empower OTs to start thinking and making more informed decisions about a client's safety. Because I think, as your example clearly articulated, your other practitioners are looking to the OT for helping. It's like, this falls within your wheelhouse. IDLs are definitely, it's just not making a meal or, bill paying tasks or, doing stitching. I mean, driving really is the summation of all of these components. But I think the other component to your question, Sarah, is that it can really help to start thinking about potential ways as therapists we can intervene if we do find an issue. And that could just be making simple recommendations to modifying a vehicle to be more driver friendly. So thinking about AOTA's CarFit would be a great program that I think nationwide has been shown to be helpful to fitting the vehicle to the client themselves, suggesting driver refresher courses. Perhaps it's the rules of the road, knowing where to look when you're coming to a complex intersection. But then I think if necessary, and this is more of a sensitive question, if the decision is made to have the client transition from a driving to a non-driving life, figuring out what those alternative methods of transportation are in their home environment. And this is a really significant problem that the field faces, is that when a client comes to see, whether it's a primary care physician, a specialist like a neurologist, you have to stop driving. You got to give up the keys. And it's just this cliff. There's no discussion about, what do I do? How do I go get my groceries? Where do I, what do I take to go to church or to, engage in social activities, right? It's good luck, figure it out on your own. And so I think this is a massive area that occupational therapy can truly intercede on behalf of our clients to say, let's figure out what those potential options are. And then the other component to that in terms of the screening is early intervention is so critical to maintaining both safety and independence for our aging drivers. And there's, like I said, a lot of tools available that I'm happy to provide after in terms of thinking about what this transition looked like and ensuring that they're going to continue to not just lead active and fulfilling lives, but to the ability to age in place, I think is paramount for us.
I'll link to all these tools in the show notes. That would have been so helpful. I bet some of them existed when I was working in outpatient and I didn't know about them and I didn't utilize them. That's kind of like the low level evaluation. I wanted to ask about the fully comprehensive driving evaluation that some OTs do. What should that look like and entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the full evaluation can certainly change, right? Because it all depends on how you are looking at the individual. So I think the conventional measure is using the on-the-road test. That's our gold standard, right? But altogether, between the United States and Canada, we only have about 1,000 certified rehabilitation specialists and driving rehabilitation specialists. That is not enough to contend with our aging population, right? And so, another way to potentially evaluate driving safety is using driving simulators, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about those. But they are quite variable in terms of the make, the model, how complex the setup is. Some simulators are actually real cars with TV screens built in, or they can be a little bit more scaled back and simplistic with just having, a monitor on your screen or on your desk along with a driving steering wheel and pedals. And what we do is chipping our participants' vehicle to look at how they're driving on a daily basis, collecting that data, and then putting it all together to get a more comprehensive assessment. But I'll talk, I think, about what the conventional standard is, which is the on-the-road test. I don't think it's new to a lot of OTs. They're probably listening right now, but there are many factors that can impact driving performance. And I think first, it's very, very important to be aware that a vehicle itself that is not their own vehicle. So let's say you're going to meet a rehab specialist or someone that has just a stock vehicle. It might have a dual brake and perhaps a dual steering wheel. There's a lot of factors that might influence their performance. And both of them are almost diametrically opposed. The first is performance anxiety, because it is kind of scary, especially if their license is on the line. And they know for a fact that if they don't pass that, they might be reported to the DMV or to the state, or that report might go back to their primary care physician saying that they're at a risk for, higher risk for crash. Think about driving cessation. That might induce a lot of anxiety. So thinking about that and maintaining that in mind is critical. You might also have the converse, which is known as the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect stipulates that if you know that you're being observed or you're being watched, you're going to overperform and do a lot better compared to if you were just sitting in your car driving, willy-nilly throughout your daily environment. So those are two components that may influence performance. But I think when performing a full evaluation, we need to consider their physical abilities like strength, coordination, reaction time that you mentioned, ensuring there aren't any, specific comorbid conditions they might have that can potentially influence, range of motion, their ability to feel the brake pedal between the gas and the brake, and all the other factors that allows them to respond and anticipate to changes occurring in the environment. So I think therapists really should assess vision, cognitive factors like attention, memory, and decision-making skills. These all influence performance on the road and their ability to safely navigate a complex traffic situation. But I think there's also other factors that we need to take into consideration beyond just specific health and comorbid conditions. So, for example, it very well could be they have arthritis or limited range of motion that if they had the appropriate adaptation, they could, like, let's say, for example, to the steering wheels or to the pedals, that might allow them to actually drive a lot better than if they didn't have that modification. And so when you're thinking about a full driving evaluation, comprehensively assessing what type of conditions they might have, what kind of medications they might be taking, along with just their overall goals and motivation. Where do you typically go? If it's just home to the grocery store and to get your medications and then back home, that's going to be very different than a client that might have a very active lifestyle and visits 50 different places in any given week. And so those are the components that need to be taken into consideration with a full evaluation. But I think the therapist should also take into account the emotional and psychological readiness of the client, as well as I alluded to the anxiety and their confidence as potentially influencing the driving performance. And this is really where our emotional intelligence really needs to be scaled up a little bit to anticipate what might be occurring and to setting them at ease. Because I think the goal ultimately of these full evaluations is to assess, can they drive safely and independently? And if they can't, is there any potential remediation or compensatory strategies that are needed to ensure that they can drive? And if not, at that time, figuring out, going back to our prior question, what do they need to stay safe in their environment? And if they can't drive safely, are there other options that we need to discuss with them to say, if you're not able to drive independently, perhaps there are alternative services, senior support services, buses, trains, light rails, other support groups that can help them being able to age independently in their own community.
I want to hone in a little bit on the driving simulator option that you mentioned. I'm coming to this as I live in a pretty remote small town in Nebraska. I know there's not one of these 1,000 driving specialists close to me. I would love to get in a car and drive with the client, but I feel like if I told my hospital that I was doing that, they would not like that and they would gear me towards a simulator. What's out there, especially that's accessible to someone like me? And I also just want to voice, I'm a little annoyed that there's not a standardized thing that we can all be doing. Why isn't there a program that is motion tracking or like, why doesn't that exist? So I
Yeah.
guess what does exist? And if you have a moment, can you tell
Yeah.
us why a standardized assessment does not exist yet and is it coming?
Yes. Well, so our goal, and this is, I think a little self-centered, is to certainly plug the naturalistic assessment that we've been piloting, and I'm happy to talk about that after I answer this question. Which is, there is unfortunately no standardized way. The road test, while it is the gold standard, what might work for our participants that we see here in St. Louis, Missouri, is going to be very different than your town in Nebraska. The routes are going to be different. The vehicles might be different. The roads, obviously, climate, all of these factors, the environmental factors that are fixed and dynamic, changing, are going to influence one's ability to drive. Simulators really have been heralded as this wonderful alternative to be able to assess driving performance, which is exactly what you're measuring on the road test. The caveat is that there's so many different makes, models. Some, as I've alluded to, are more complex and more expensive than others. But overall, simulators are fantastic because they can increase the accessibility to evaluate driving performance among OTs and really be a very powerful tool to looking to see they're in a safe environment, so you don't have to take them out onto the road as your hospital administrators and other safety officers might be worried about in terms of liability. But then I think what you can also do is program, whether it is a standard desktop simulator or some of the more expensive ones, a variety of real world conditions, like sudden stops, navigating around, an intersection or a crash on the road, forcing them to drive fast and seeing how they respond. And a lot of them do have eye tracking software to see where is the eye positioned. Are they maintaining, attentiveness onto the road? Are they drifting or shifting? So all of these things you can actually program into a simulator to be able to test the capacity of their performative abilities. And I think another strength of that is they offer a way to assess driving abilities, of course, without the risk of an on-road test or potential for risk for crashing, where you would have to intervene as an occupational therapist or as a driving rehabilitation specialist. But they can also be tailored to specific populations. So, for example, if you are in a primary or a specialty clinic that's treating clients that are recovering from stroke or traumatic brain injury or cognitive impairment or even symptomatic dementia, you can then, instill a suite of different programs to test those specific abilities for the individual to be able to drive safely and adjust the complexities of those driving scenarios based on the client's needs or your practice's specific needs. So I think that personal approach to evaluation is really wonderful and a very strong pro for using driving simulators. And the other component, though, Sarah, I think is also really helpful for some of the driving simulators is you can track performance over time. So, for example, if you're evaluating a client at your baseline evaluation, you can see what they look like. 3 months, 6 months later, you can look to see, is there change over time? Are they improving? Are they getting better? But more importantly, you can program feedback within the simulator to see if you are able to provide feedback, are they responding to it, and is there improvement? And if there isn't, I think that can also help to inform care and how treatment should be tailored, in addition to potentially influencing, do we need to start thinking about driving cessation and what a life would look like post driving cessation? So again, practical options, accessibility for clinicians to assess, enhancing and supporting driving safety, making them more very valuable. But the caveat is that it's important to keep in mind that there is a high learning curve. You have to have some of these programmings done ahead of time by software engineers or working with companies that are selling these to ensure that you're getting essentially what you want. It's tailored for your clinic, your hospital, your outpatient, whatever it might be, and that it's done in an objective and consistent fashion. But I'm also watching out for simulator sickness, particularly among older adults. That does occur. And so you want to make sure you're anticipating for some of these potential side effects.
I'm hearing you say simulators have a role for us. There's some benefits to them. But are you alluding to that potentially the future standardized assessment for fitness to drive would be this naturalistic tracking that you're exploring? And is anything accessible to us now? Is there something I can stick in a car for my patients like you're doing?
Yeah, so you have, yeah, this is a great question. So this is of course my bias and my disclosures, which is we've been actively working in this area of research for the past 9 years. So since 2015, we actually took a commercial data logger, which looks just like this. We plug into the onboard diagnostic port, or OBD2 port, in vehicles that are manufactured from 1996 onward. And we have now been able to adapt them into fully electric vehicles. Because if you have an electric vehicle here in the United States, you're not subjected to the requirements, the federal requirements to have an OBD2 port. And then so we're able to adapt the same methodology to track those that are in fully electric vehicles, including Teslas and those that have those remote driving capabilities. And so the fact of the matter is, it is very difficult to scale the complexities of driving just seasonally. A person's driving in winter is going to look markedly different than it would in spring or summer. And especially daylight savings time versus when it ends. And so there are all of these multiple different components that will vary. And so what we decided to do was jump into the deep end of things and figure out, can we measure everything about the environment? And so what this allows us to do is we chip their vehicle, and it's very unobtrusive. So it's not as if we're sticking a camera and, they know they're being recorded, and they may not necessarily feel comfortable with it. And a lot of our participants didn't really feel comfortable. So it's unobtrusive, takes about 30 seconds to install. And what it allows us to do is gather this data in an objective, reliable fashion, because as soon as we plug it in, it syncs to available satellites and starts sending that data via cell phone towers to our servers. And then we get that literally every single time a vehicle is driven. There's no capacity, there's no cap in terms of we have to contend with X amount of data being restrictive. And so what it does is it allows us to build this complex profile for our participants to see, this is what it looks like. Let's say baseline's 1 month or 3 months. Is that changing over time? And are they speeding a lot more, hard braking a lot more? Or is their life space shrinking? Because we can take this latitude and longitude every second that we're getting and build geospatial maps to look to see, are they visiting the places that they used to? And then is isolation kicking in? And are we starting to see their literal life space shrinking? And so we have a combination of what we call non-spatial and spatial factors, right? And we're putting that together to really get a comprehensive understanding of what does aging look like, where they live in their own home environment. So we're making it as meaningful as possible. We're not forcing them to come into us. And, if they have any questions or concerns, especially if they, have gotten to a crash, we can certainly address that with them. And so the future, I really think, when we're thinking about driving, is going to be a combination. This isn't to really downplay or dissuade the value of the on-road assessment or driving simulator. But when we're thinking about an aging population, in the tens of millions, right, who are still driving with a complexity of different medical conditions on a daily basis, we really need something that can gather that data in real time, filter through our pipelines that we have, and essentially look at risk, create this algorithm score. Are you at a high risk for a crash? Are you declining? Do we need to continue maintaining monitoring? Or if you're safe and perfectly fine, then we can really not have to worry about that already. What's been very challenging, though, is the human element, as you can imagine. Because the typical vehicle has roughly about 30,000 parts, right? And there's only one consistent part that will always fail, roughly about 97% of the time. And that's the human element. It increases the risk of crashes and all the, the unfortunate things that we have to contend with. And so what we're able to do is really factor in, looking at their history, their medical records, conditions they may have, medications they might be taking, and saying, here's your risk for driving decline, or here's your crash risk. Now, because I'm really in the sphere of research, figuring out what that looks like is very, very complex. And that's why we have to get more data. It's what the scientists always say, we need more data, we need more data. And it really has what I thought was, going to be a 1 or 2 year project. We're in year 9, going to year 10 right now. But what I can say, arguably, is that we are getting much better at taking the large mass of data, figuring out what it looks like for that potential participant or client, because we truly do want them to be tailored to the individual. Because my driving in St. Louis is going to be very different than your driving in Nebraska, right? And it's not fair to compare my driving to yours or to some gold standard, right? Because we want to take into account the complexity of where they're living, what their vehicle, type of vehicle, age of the vehicle, all its functional capabilities, in addition to the individual and all of those personal factors, and put it together to say, here's what your baseline risk factor looks like. Let's continue to monitor to see if you can decline. So to answer the question that you originally asked, right now, there is nothing ready-made available to be deployed, but my goal, my professional goal and personal goal is to actually have a product, something that we can deploy nationwide and actually potentially internationally, because the United States isn't the only country facing this tsunami, but many other countries in North America, Europe, and other places are also having these very same discussions and figuring out ways we can address this national issue.
This is just blowing my mind a little bit. So I'm starting to see this reality coming where somehow naturalistic driving's being tracked. It's tracking your crash risk rate. At some point, it's getting high enough that you're getting flagged. And then that's the point where maybe you're like, okay, you need to go see an OT. Mm-hmm. And where that's intersecting with me personally is I look back to these sessions that I told you about that I did. And I honestly, at the time, I felt great about them. I was like, yes, I gathered some clear data. I feel like me and the doctor were like, high five, we got this person off the road. But now that I'm looking at this new research, what I totally completely failed at is walking through driving cessation with that client. We did not talk about the next plan. We were just like off the road. That's the goal. But I see that becoming like a major part of our role is navigating driving cessation. I think I read in one of your papers related to dementia that once driving cessation happens, your risk for depression goes up by quite a bit. And that's so intuitive, but it wasn't on my radar. So all of that to say, again, to this question of what do you recommend to us as OTs for navigating driving cessation? I know we've alluded to it a couple times, but this feels important. Let's hit it. Yeah.
So I'll start, I think we're right with some of the studies that we've done, which is it's looking at as soon as you give up the keys, right? There is not just a higher risk for depression, but their entire social support network starts to shrink rapidly. There is a higher risk for transitioning into long-term care, and associated with that is also a higher risk for mortality. So when we say, driving is really the key to independence, especially here in the United States, where, in many places, public transportation, reliable mass transit is just not available. And just to give you context, the United States landmass, 97% of the United States landmass is considered to be rural. That means 3% is a combination of urban and suburban areas. But more importantly, only 20% of the U.S. population resides in rural areas, but we're starting to see the expansion into rural areas. And so it really is very important. And cessation is very complex. It's one of the most sensitive topics that I think an older adult and their family have to contend with. And often that is thrusted upon the physician or a specialist geriatrician, because when we're thinking about driving, besides it being of this very important ideal, it's critical for workforce engagement, social connectivity, community mobility, and just being able to age in place. And having the conversation itself is very challenging, but we need to start thinking about acknowledging how difficult it is to be able to give up driving, not just for the individual, but I think others on the road as well and their family members. Because we do see, patients and clients that we've had, they don't have loved ones. So they're only relying on themselves to go get their groceries, medications, to engage with their community. Their loved ones might be many states away and may not be able to provide that support. Uber, Lyft, or e-hail, as it's formerly known as, the electronic hail transportation industry, may not also be readily available in some of these cities. And so I think there needs to be a very careful consideration about what those safety concerns are, and then starting from that point to see, do we really need to think about taking them off the road because somebody reported something, right? Very well could be there's enough capacity there to stay driving for at least a few more years. But I think also framing the discussion, if the decision is made to take them off the road, as finding the best way to maintain their safety and independence and mobility, and exploring what those alternative options might be. The key point, I think, is involving the individual, involving the client, first and foremost at the very onset of that discussion. Too often, what occurs is that loved ones and family members will get together, talk about it. Mom and dad aren't safe to drive from the road, or grandma and grandpa, whatever it might be, and they make the decision and they talk to the clinician. And so essentially, what you have is this pitting against the individual and the patient, the client, and everyone else. And it really puts them at odds. And you'll see a lot of unfortunate, conflict occur, interpersonal conflict occur because they weren't involved at that very onset. And I think also asking for their input in terms of how do they feel about their driving? Do they think they're having difficulty? Do they see changes occurring that perhaps they hadn't noticed beforehand? And part of this, I think, is just really respect, showing respect for their autonomy as independent human beings, and then giving them some semblance of control. That's really one of the big, unfortunate missteps that I see occurring a lot within families and folks that I talk to quite a bit. The other component too, Sarah, I think, is having a trial period where they may not necessarily drive for, a month or 2 months to see, are they able to do the things that they normally would before, taking the keys away. I think that abrupt end to it is just so really jarring, right? It's very deeply problematic for a lot of folks, and that can elicit more changes in terms of psychosomatic and psychosocial factors: depression, anxiety, apathy, neuropsychiatric symptoms that also increase. The other component of this is that we have 50 states with very different laws on when a person should come off the road, what that looks like, who's mandatory reporting. As a therapist, what are your obligations to the DMV? What are the obligations to your licensing board? Same thing with clinicians, right? And so learning more about what your state's recommendations are and what they support, I think, is paramount as a therapist here. Most states do provide very detailed information on their websites in terms of if you have concerns about safe driving for an older adult. Here's what they would recommend: is it vision checking, have an on-road test being conducted at the local DMV, who's authorized to make that report, what occurs after that report is made. But I really think that there are separate roles for OTs, physicians, and family members that we have to focus on depending on the state you're living on or you're living in, and then ensuring, where do we start? So part of that is, again, starting that conversation with the clients, pulling in their family, friends, if they have those, having a conversation with a social worker, a primary care physician. And it really needs to be that team effort when we're thinking about addressing that almost the Titanic problem of driving cessation, because we're taught how to drive well in our driver's ed class when you get your license when you're 16. There is nothing at the end of life to say, here's how we think about driving cessation.
This whole discussion is just, I guess, blowing my mind. I think because I started at this naive place where I was like, autonomous vehicles are going to save us, but that's not happening. But there's all these really interesting things happening. And I think the last question I want to ask is just, what do we need to prepare for this new reality? I'm thinking in particular in terms of like our business models. Are the front lines of this change going to be our driving specialists? Do we just need a lot more of those? Is it upskilling our outpatient OTs? I was starting to think, like, should communities be hiring OTs? Like, because it's so holistic. I guess, where do we fit in this ecosystem in the future? What's your ideal of what that would look like?
Yeah. So I know I'll touch really briefly on the autonomous vehicle. I know the myth and the perception is that they're going to solve everything, and I'm not a technophile or technophobe by any means. A Luddite, I actually love technology, but it is not. It's certainly not a panacea. I think we are certainly at the cusp, but we have billions of miles of testing that need to be conducted. We need to shift away from, essentially doing testing in states that are more tempered in terms of the weather and climate, like California and Arizona, to more complex and weather environments. We also need to bring the cost down of those electronic vehicles, and really, I'd average about 30 to 40 years away from where current technology and the perception of current technology, but also the myth that's being perpetuated in mainstream media is like they're going to solve everything. It really isn't. You still need the human element within it. And I think this is, to dovetail into your question, where occupational therapist is the best primed profession to address this complex problem. And I'm a little biased, not just as a professional and a clinician, but also as a researcher. So I think what we really need to do, Sarah, is to make the OT services for driving more accessible. We really need to scale up a little bit more and start considering the business models, whether this is private or just going to your local clinic, your outpatient, inpatient practice and saying, look, we need to start addressing this, screening for it more often within inpatient or outpatients that we're seeing because it is a critical area. We also need to support legislation that prioritizes the affordability and the availability of OT services. I think one potential business model is involving partnership with healthcare providers, insurance companies, critically, health insurance companies to be specific, not the automotive industry, driving schools and driving programs. Because I think by integrating OT into the conversation of these existing programs, we can start to incorporate this as a routine part of our annual or standard OT evaluations, right? And so part of this is normalizing this as you do range of motion, manual muscle testing, right? Why not have evaluating driving fitness to drive, but also performance as a core component? Another step to sort of go back to the advocating for legislation, I think, is promoting public safety and evaluation tools. If an individual is at risk, what does that look like? And this is going to be connecting that driving cessation cliff that I mentioned before and thinking about the complexities of medical conditions. Vision tests are just not going to do it. You really need a comprehensive assessment and packaging it all together to say, because they have all these conditions, they're on these types of medications, before even plugging a chip into their vehicle, we know they're at a risk for a crash based on the existing literature, right? And so I think sensitizing not just the profession, but also our peers in terms of whether they're nurses, nurse practitioners, our other rehab, allied health professionals, clinicians, specifically physicians and neurologists, they are hungry for this knowledge. And I really think we are primed as occupational therapists to be able to say, here's why this is critical and an important area. And going back to, I think, the remoteness of certain places, and particularly considering where you live in Nebraska, I really think we need to explore telehealth models to deliver OT services for driving assessments critically for rural health. I think since the pandemic, telehealth has been catapulted because we can go in to see our clinicians or provide services as we would like to. And so as a result, the bandwidth to be able to do assessments remotely has increased significantly, or at least to do very brief evaluations. And I think that's really a great starting point for therapists who don't have to be experts in driving. You certainly don't. We already come pre-installed with the toolkit to be able to evaluate each of these areas and putting it together to say, here's what this client has. Here's their risk for driving decline. And so I think the combination of scaling up our profession to be able to address driving at virtually every single setting, working with legislators to get reimbursements, Medicare, Medicaid, and other private insurance companies, health insurance companies specifically, and then also normalizing this by employing telehealth, working with other professionals to make this a normative part of clinical evaluation. Those are all prime areas that we can expand in as a profession.
I am just so exhilarated by this conversation. We see the need out there, like both as a profession, but just as humans, as individuals in our community, we see the need for more driving support. I get excited as an occupational therapist thinking about if I could help with some of these things related to driving, medication management, reaction time. It's going to like improve quality of life across the whole day too. It's not just going to help you with driving, it's going to help your whole quality of life. I would love for us to be seeing more of these clients. And I see these business models that you're talking about, this opportunity to really bring our profession to the forefront and help meet this huge need. My mind is just spinning as we're closing today. What's the final thought you want to leave us on?
I'll try to be as brief as possible because there's so much. My mind is also blown on a daily basis with the research that we do and also the massive need. I think the most important thing that I like to communicate is that driving and aging in the United States is really a critical area, not just for research, but more importantly in terms of thinking about the need for clinicians to be able to evaluate it in real time. We have a massive aging population that needs therapists and other professionals to be able to intercede and to support them as they're going through this very complex change towards the end of life. And, as we age, everything, unfortunately declines: vision, reaction time, hearing, cognition, which I study, making this complex task a lot more challenging. And I think it's also important as therapists for us to be able to not just understand these changes, but educate our clients and their family members, in addition to the greater community, to ensure they're all cognizant of, this shift in the population. And so early recognition of these, I think, will allow better screening, leading to better interventions and allowing individuals to be more independent for a lot longer. And I'll recount one brief study that we did a few years ago that really, I think, emphasized how important driving is to our population here in the United States, but also to think to older adults. We asked two questions. The one question was, we asked roughly 700 older adults, so what age do you expect to live to? And they had that number. And how many years of driving life do you have left? And they also wrote down that age, right? And so what we found was, among these participants, more than 3/4, so 75% of the sample, expected to drive 1 year after they had died, and roughly 14% of that sample expected to live or to drive 12 years after they had died. And so you might think it's incorrect math, but it wasn't. So they weren't thinking, and that's why we spread the two questions apart. I think what it emphasized for us is not just the importance of driving, but how critical and central it is for their ability to just function and live. So I think when we're thinking about driving cessations, these are very, very difficult conversations to have, but they're necessary and they're important, but it needs to be done with such care and sensitivity that I think as therapists, we're well equipped to understand what's the goal of our clients. What do they need to be able to age in place, right? And then how can we meet that with whether it's remediation, compensatory techniques, working with other practitioners to be able to support them, whether they're transition to a non-driving life, transition to long-term care, ensuring their goals are still being met.
Well, Ganesh, I'm so thankful that you have turned your OT brain to this huge topic. I love seeing how you're putting the client at the center, how you're really focusing on naturalistic driving. That's like the most OT thing I've ever heard. And this has just been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today and just for all that you've shared.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Wow, you all, I think you could probably hear my mind just being blown during this interview. I literally came to this topic thinking that technology would save us. But after reading this research and talking to Ganesh, I am feeling like we need technology plus occupational therapy to make the roads a safer place for older drivers and for all drivers. As always, I really want to hear your thoughts. If you are a casual listener, we would love a review from you. You can now review us on Google from our homepage. or we always appreciate your comments on our YouTube video. But the best place to really discuss the implications of all of this is in the OT Potential Club, and I will be watching for your comments in our forum. The OT Potential Club is also where you will go to earn a CEU certificate for your time today. What you are going to do next is head to otpotential.com and either sign in or sign up for the OT Potential Club. Once you are in the club, you can take a 5-question test, and when you pass, we will generate a certificate for your time today. Okay, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope this podcast helps you feel informed and inspired as an OT professional. Take care, and we'll talk next time.